Right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this session where we are discussing Kenyan recovery and East African recovery. And my panelists will all be virtual. They shall be joining us shortly. But what I would like us to apply our minds to in the next 40 or so minutes is really disaggregating this discussion. Many times when you talk about the recovery, the question is it V-shaped recovery? Is it U-shaped? And it sounds extremely far-fetched and at distance from us. So we are disaggregating this into various sectors to the best that we can, and at least getting it into a way we can relate. And we will be having Dr. Carmen Nibigira, who is from the Destination Management and Tourism Policy in Burundi, where she's an analyst. We shall be having Dr. Narendra Raval, the Chief Executive Officer of the DevKey Group. We shall also be having Mr. Hosea Mashuki, the Chief Executive Officer of the Fresh Produce Exporters Association of Kenya. And we shall also be joined by Mr. Tewolde Gebre Mariam, who is the Group Chief Executive Officer of the Ethiopian Airlines, to give us a perspective of how aviation is unfolding and the role it will play as far as the recovery of Kenya and the larger East Africa is concerned. So that is a discussion we'll be looking into. And the key question is, how does East Africa get back the robust economic growth that was projected pre-pandemic? Of course, we've had a couple of shocks, so we're looking at how to build resilience and really a carry forward from the conversation we had yesterday in two sessions. The first one was on the shape of the economy going forward, and the second one was on digging the economy out of crisis. And maybe just to put the question out there, when we think about a Kenyan or East African recovery, what comes to mind? And I don't know whether we have a revolving mic around which could help us. I would request if you could walk to the mic stand so that we get some thoughts. Dr. Kitui, do you want to share a thought or two about an East African recovery just before we kickstart? I see. So we'll be unpacking that subject to see what this means for the region, what this means for East Africa, as we get our panelists set for the conversation, which we should be starting shortly. This will be taking us into the second last session of the Kusi Ideas Festival.
Excuse me, just 1 minute. I fix this. Technology, Louis. Thank you so much. Julians, thank you. As we organize the virtual panelists, just to remind us again that COVID-19 is real. Please let's adhere to those strict guidelines, and also to participate in the conversations that we are having here, at least online, if you're not among us. The hashtag is KusiFest 2020. Since yesterday, we've had some very, very, very good deliberations and discussions on matters affecting the continent, where we are, and how we proceed from here for the betterment of this continent. Africa alone has, I think, 2 or 3 of the fastest growing economies in the world at present, Ethiopia being among them. Julian, so you will be speaking to the CEO of Ethiopian Airlines. And so as we set up for that, let's keep engaging really on any of the sessions that we've had that you maybe have a contribution on. And while at that as well, within the audience, if there's anyone who has a point, not really specific to what Julians will be discussing, anything that we've discussed across the 2 days, please feel free as we set up for this. Are we ready? But then as we continue with that, then Julians, I think, let me ask you this question. How do you think we do it? Because we heard from the president yesterday, Uhuru Kenyatta, His Excellency, and he says some of these relief measures will be coming to a close, at the end of this month. How do we do it? Because many people are still within the trenches, so to speak.
It's a very good question you're asking, because I had this conversation with the CS of the National Treasury, that is Honorable Ukur Yatani, And the truth of the matter is that if you read the Article 4 from the IMF concluding the mission statement in Kenya in November, which is just last month, there was the call for fiscal consolidation, as they term it. And that should ensure that we are ramping up our revenue, especially given that our tax base is not as wide as we would have desired, because our tax to GDP ratio has been on a general decline. And what the signal that sends is that now, when it comes to mobilizing our revenue, we have a challenge.
Yes.
So the fiscal stimulus measures, by the words of the Treasury CS, was that it should be temporary, it should be targeted, it should be timely. And therefore, there was a time to come when this would be reversed. There are divergent views. This should go on a little longer into the end of the next financial year, but clearly there's a lot of pressure on the government as far as revenue mobilization goes.
Trade is very key to this, and I think between Kenya and Uganda, we've had issues, along the border, movement of goods and trade volumes also being affected by that. Are there any measures to at least reduce that backlog that we are seeing in Busia and the other, border points, really?
Yes, we had a sit down with the CS Aden Mohammed, who heads up the East African integration, and we had a conversation around the bottlenecks that exist across the borders and how this is being streamlined. The issue has been with the COVID specifications of the testing. There was a bit of challenge. You're supposed to do it in Kenya, you enter Tanzania or Uganda, you're supposed to do it again, and that created a backlog. But he assured us that the same is being streamlined, at least looking into 2021, so that we don't have that non-tariff barrier to trade.
Okay.
And I hear Hosea Mashuki of the Fresh Produce Exporters Association of Kenya is now ready to join us in the conversation, a Kenyan recovery and East African recovery. Jose, if you can hear me, we are having this conversation at a time when Kenya and the UK are engaging in a post-Brexit trade deal. Extremely critical if you consider the volume of exports that we take to that market. How do you expect this to impact the recovery? I think the horticulture sector is one of the one that was hardest hit when COVID-19 started in the East African region. Hosea, over to you.
Thank you very much. Yes, as you're aware, UK and Kenya are negotiating a trade deal that was actually signed yesterday by the ministers. This is very important for us. We did request the government to be able to negotiate for two key things: duty-free, quota-free entry of Kenyan fresh produce into the UK, and we have been able to get that, so we are happy about it. And so we see a potential for increase of our fresh produce exports by about 5% into the UK market by 2025. And this, will really assist the growers, farmers, and exporters of the Republic of Kenya. Thank you.
Hosea, just to stay with you before I let you go, the question of phytosanitary conditions has been a sticky issue as far as our exports accessing the international markets are concerned. Even as we prepare for the demand side, how are we streamlining this on the supply side? Because now that the responsibility falls within our side, not the European market.
Thank you very much. As you're aware, we as representatives of the growers and exporters are working around the clock to ensure that we fulfill the requirements of the market. And according to WTO rules, we are basically looking at doing our bit to ensure that whatever that we export out of this country, adheres to the national and international standards. So the government agencies that are, in this area, especially the Kenya Plant Health Inspector Service, working with the Horticulture Crops Directorate, and ourselves as growers and exporters, are working closely under the leadership of the Ministry of Agriculture to ensure that our farmers are well trained. They position themselves in a manner that they will be able to grow that which is good and is good for Kenyans and also is good for the rest of the market. Thank you.
And just before we cross over to someone else, we're trying to get a hold of them. Hosea, one of the key developments in the year 2020, aside from COVID, is the fact that we've seen a significant depreciation of the Kenya shilling vis-a-vis other global hard currencies. If you look at the dollar, for example, we closed yesterday at 111.0 units, which is about 9% down since the start of the year. Ideally, this would have meant a very good development on your side as an exporter. How has it been, and how do you see it going into 2021? Because that would mean then our exports are becoming a lot cheaper in the global market.
In fact, if you look at the figures for 2019, the total export value was 153 billion Kenya shillings. As at 30th of November 2020, we have already exported fresh produce valued at 139 billion shillings. We expect that within the month of December, we are going to probably go up to 145, which to me is just like 5% of a difference between last year and this year. Ideally, without the disruption of COVID, 2020 was expected to be a good year for us. So yes, with the depreciation, we get more dollars into our pockets. However, we were quite hard hit by the cost of air freight, somewhere between March and August, getting into September. Thank you.
And staying with the subject of the cost of air freight, something which has been a matter of intense interest, especially given that when we had international air travel suspended, it was only cargo which was applying. How are you working with your airline partners to address this challenge? Because clearly they need you in this case as much as you do need them to access the market.
Thank you very much. Quite early in the year, we brought this issue to the attention of the national government. And we are happy that the president was gracious enough to allocate 1.5 billion shillings to support exports of horticulture out of Kenya. As representatives of the growers and exporters, we have written to Treasury with a recommendation that that money is allocated to our national carrier, Kenya Airways, so that that brings down our freight charges, especially to Netherlands and UK, by about $1. So that the rest of the money then helps the exporters to, continue with their business. So that's what we've done. And at this moment, we are just encouraging the ministry to fast track the release of the funds to the national carrier. And before I go, I would like to say that, Kenya has very nice products. For those of you who don't know, about 40% of the flowers in Europe come from Kenya. I mean, the Queen of England eats sweet potato from Bomet. If it's good for the Queen, it's good for everybody in the UK, But we haven't been able to brand that. We haven't been able to sell that. We have one of the best, varieties of roses that have a vessel life of between 14 to 16 days on arrival. And we just need to ensure that we tell the world this. I mean, we have very good avocado, for example. Recently, of course, you had some negative news from one of our companies, and it's just international, business. And we just need to be resilient and tell the people of the world that we have the best that is produced under the sun. Thank you.
Jose, before I let you go, please stay with me as I try to get my other panelists. Something which you've mentioned, and two questions here. The argument has been tabled that it is important, and what COVID has really shown us is that we need a diversification of markets. Clearly, Europe can continue to be the anchor market, but are we doing enough? And even as we look at the Kenyan and East African recovery, how do we diversify our destination markets so that when the shocks are hitting one side, at least we are sufficiently hedged in terms of revenues?
Two things that we need to do. One is that we need to diversify our product offering. And number two, we need to diversify our markets. Currently, for example, we don't export much to the United States of America, 300 million people. We do not export to a lot of other countries in Asia because of two things. One is the phytosanitary requirements, and two is the duty. We continue working with government to encourage them to negotiate, trade deals that are responsive to our business. And so, yes, we look at expanding our markets, especially in the UAE and further in Australia, and also even within some countries in Europe where we have not really been able to push our volumes. So that's one of the things that we do, but also we are encouraging our growers and farmers to expand the range from the current restriction of the products that we have.
Jose, you mentioned the US market, and it's important you mention that because we are having this discussion at a time when Kenya and the United States are pursuing a free trade agreement. Well, we hope this will be carried forward into the Biden administration. How do you expect this to impact your produce and access to the global markets, because that is one vast market?
Yes, two things are critical here. In that negotiation, we need, from a trade point of view, duty-free, quota-free entry of our produce into the US. And number two, we need reasonable phytosanitary protocols negotiated between the Kenyan government and the US government to allow us, for example, to export our French beans wholesome and also our fruits. Once that is concluded, then we can be able to push our mangoes and avocados and French beans and broccoli and all that we have. Currently, we export flowers to the US, but really it's less than 1%. So we'd like to have more of promoting the Kenyan brand, because our flowers are completely different from those produced in Colombia and other Latin American countries, because they are big head, we are able to produce the small heads, and so that will get into a different market within the US. Thank you.
And Jose, sorry to keep you still with us. The issue of value chains is very critical, and why I raise this is because when I speak to players within the horticulture space, the question of post-harvest loss is quite significant in their consideration. And when we look at the dent that has on their net earnings at the end of the day, it's quite significant if you look at the inputs that they invest in for their productivity. How do you think this can be addressed looking ahead?
Now, by the way, Kenya has one of the best cold chain systems in the world. You'll be surprised. Having said that, that works largely for commercial large-scale farmers who are doing, fruits and vegetables and flowers. However, for the majority of the Kenyans, especially smallholder farmers, they do not have proper access to the cold chain facilities. And this is where we encourage county governments, working with the national government and other stakeholders to have discussions about how we can be able to reduce the post-harvest losses, especially for food, from about 35 to 40% down to some, 5%. The rest of the food that gets west then can be consumed locally. We can add value to it, and we can export it. We have tremendous demand for our mangoes, for example, that, because of the post-harvest losses, Kenya produces about 800,000 metric tons of mangoes. We just export probably 10% of that. The rest we consume here, and the rest then goes to West. So it's about partnerships, working together with county government, national government, and private sector to ensure that everything is put in place. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Jose. And let me cross over to Dr. Mukisa Kitui, who earlier had indicated he didn't have a question at the time, but I'm happy to engage him at this point. Dr. When we talk about the issue of a Kenyan and East African recovery, looking into 2021, what are some of the priority areas you would advise we take into consideration? Sorry, his mic, please.
Yeah, no, it's working. A number of things are, I will front load a number of things. First of all, targeted resourcing for small and medium enterprises. And secondly, addressing pre-existing challenges to competitiveness. That why were our engagement, our exports becoming increasingly non-competitive? And I mentioned some of these yesterday. Loading produce with all manner of levies by both devolved and national government translates into non-competitiveness. 3, know that we cannot go back to the traditional normal. So you start looking at what are the levers of a new changed competitive East Africa. More attention to intangibles. It is not magic when you talk digital economy, people start thinking you're talking computer-related things. But just in a country like Kenya, every day you have more than 100 trucks passing through Busia, Kisumu, or Malaba, Bungoma, from Uganda going to Mombasa, many of them empty. If you just created electronic market visibility for produce available in the neighborhood of those routes to be competed for an auctioning space for transport services from Rangala or from Turbo to Nairobi, you could wipe out the leech called the middleman, who has been consuming most of the benefits of agriculture in Western Kenya. If you combine that with market consolidation that you deliver, the last mile is not just delivering food by Jumuiya. Last mile can be delivering fresh tilapia from Kisumu to roll back the increasing importation of tilapia from China. It can be delivering the bananas from Bungoma directly to the secondary kitchen, restaurants around Nairobi. So building electronic logistics to be able to cut out the middleman and increase the farm gate benefit to the farmer is going to be one of the possibilities of renewed growth in East Africa. Third, East Africa can have all the greatest ideas, but if we do not establish credible long-term peace in the region, all our efforts will unravel. The rumblings are west of Kenya, uncertainties north of Kenya, tiff between Kenya and its southern neighbor, are little things that we must overcome in order to think together about how do we synergize, create regional value chains, and create new livelihoods.
Before I let you go, Dr. Kitui, let me just ask this question very quickly. You talked about the issue of competitiveness, and now we are getting into the Africa Continental Free Trade Area framework, where the markets will be significantly liberalized. Do you see that as a potential challenge because there are markets like Egypt, South Africa, which now have access here? And the truth is, when you look at something like the cost of electricity alone, we are not that competitive.
All right. The developmental state, which is a major phenomenon that we have to deal with, has very clear industrial policy, which says which sectors of the economy require state subsidy and intervention in order to make ourselves competitive. In our case, we cannot run away from the reality that our greatest potential lies in Africa. Europe is important, and America is perhaps going to be also important, but they are increasingly looking local. So what it means is that we have to address our weaknesses as competitors in the African market. Number of things are important. I think Kenya can make Made in Kenya competitive again. We just have to radically transform the energy sector. The continued burden of dirty, expensive biofuel generators can be retired in the name of environmental responsibility. The world will not fight Kenya if you say unilaterally, we are wiser than we were when we allowed diesel barges to supply us electricity. We want to replace them with solar and wind energy, and want to replace them with cheaper geothermal energy. That is a direction that will dramatically reduce the cost of energy, and you pass it to the producers. I think such things, but also importantly, you can't do it alone. You know, one of the biggest challenges for Africa's potential for internal trade is what is called the rules of origin. How can I be sure that when I see a product written on made in Burkina Faso, it actually comes from Burkina Faso? You know, Kenya has been importing sugar labeled made in Mumias. Once you defeat that demon, then you're on course to unlocking the power of African integration.
I see. Thank you so much, Dr. I wish we could have a conversation on the sugar sector, but maybe for another day. Let me cross over to Dr. Carmen Nibigira, all the way in Burundi, where she's a key stakeholder in the tourism sector. Dr. Carmen, if you can hear me, tourism has come under immense strain in light of COVID-19. And the question is, how do we repackage our products in the new norm that we are now navigating? What is the future of mice, for example? Because this kind of arena is not common anymore. Dr. Kamen, I was asking, what is the future of tourism? It is a clear key engine in the East African economy, I should say, but COVID has been a disruptor, and we have to rethink the products and the offerings we have out there. What do you think is the way forward? What is the future of maize, for example? Please unmute your mic, Dr. We seem to have a challenge getting Dr. Carmen Nibigira in Burundi. She is a key stakeholder in the tourism sector there. And the tourism sector, we do understand, has taken a significant hit this year, especially in light of COVID-19. And we are having a very broad-based conversation, whether it is the product offering, whether it is pricing. Can we focus a lot more on the domestic market just to see how we create a balancing wheel so that when the international arrivals are subdued, as we have seen this year, that the sector is still able to tide through a crisis of this scope and nature. And we shall be seeing whether we can get back to her for more commentary on that subject. Do we have Hosea on the line? Not yet. We don't have him? Okay. Hosea, if you could get your video on, we would like to continue our conversation focusing on the horticulture sector. We discussed the value chain, and you were mentioning issues of access to cold chain facilities. Is this fundamentally a cost question when you look at the farmers that you work with?
That's a cost center for any person who is involved in fresh produce. Remember, the moment you pluck a fruit out of the tree, or indeed a vegetable, you immediately start the process of senescence. Which means that within at most 3 hours, you should be able to get your vegetables or your fruits into a cold storage system. Now, there are various models of doing that, but the ones that are currently available are rather expensive, and so smallholder farmers especially are not able to access that.
And when you talk about smallholder farmers, just keen to understand what proportion of the aggregate sector would you say they constitute? Because clearly, if the cost is the cost-centered concern is huge here, then we certainly need to find solutions that are targeted at the needs of the smallholder farmer.
I mean, generally speaking, as you know, 70% of the farmers in Kenya are smallholder farmers. And even those that are large and commercial farmers, I will tell you for a fact, the cold rooms you see around the airport, for example, companies spend upwards of 10 million shillings a month on electricity alone. And you know, the cost of that equipment also is high. Recently, we were at the Mombasa International Airport, the Moi International Airport, Mombasa, and I mean, 4 weeks ago, there was completely no cold storage. So the fish that comes out of Mombasa or any fresh produce out of that port didn't have that. But KQ has been able to at least put a river there, and somebody's building some cold storage facility. You can imagine. So, and the whole of that coastal region has tremendous potential because of the weather and the fertile soils. Thank you.
And staying with you, Hosea, the question here is we seem to be skewed significantly on what happens post-harvest. What about the pre-harvest experience? Would you say there are significant challenges being experienced on this side, particularly when it comes to the cost of inputs to the farmer?
Yes, generally speaking, if you take a walk around Africa, you'll find that here in Kenya, and Dr. Mukisa Kitui has alluded to that, we load what I consider as unnecessary costs, levies, and charges to the farmers. I mean, our fertilizers are expensive, our seeds are expensive. You know, if we are charging, you know, levy, I think it's 5%, or is it 4%, when we import an equipment like a tractor, agricultural machinery, how do you then expect the cost of plowing an acre of land to go down? I mean, we have counties still charging cess for, you know, movement of food from one county to another, and it's just absurd. I mean, this has to be changed for us to be competitive. I mean, producing one egg in Uganda will cost you probably 3-4 shillings. Producing a similar egg in Kenya will cost you probably 7-8 shillings. I mean, the chicken is the same. It's just that we are not competitive enough. We have not had a discussion as a country to see how we can support sectors like horticulture that employs so many people, that brings in, forex, and is a low-hanging fruit. I mean, we are right at the equator. We can produce January to December, but we just need to fix our stuff as a country and clearly provide an enabling environment for the farmers and the businesses that run this sector.
Right, Hosea, thank you so much for giving us the perspective of that cost differential between Kenya and Uganda as far as the production of eggs are concerned. I'll be coming back to you, but there is a comment from a gentleman on the floor. If you could please raise your question or comment, please. Thank you. And please introduce yourself. Thank you.
Hello. My name is Vinod Patel. My question, actually it's not a question, but just a suggestion. When we talk about trade and Kenya being an important part of East Africa, the biggest challenge currently we have is the skills. You know, the reason why we import everything from China or other countries is just because we do not have enough skills. And rightly, what Dr. Mukisa said, that the challenges of the county to county trade is also a big problem because of the different taxes that every county is paying when distributing their goods. So we have to really make sure that our polytechnics or village polytechnics should be activated, and all the trainings should start from the village polytechnics so that we get the required skills for our market. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that comment and the issue you bring about on human capital. I don't know whether Governor Nyong'o, you have a comment around human capital. Sorry, the governor's mic, please. The governor's mic, please.
Somebody enable me. Oh, thank you very much. Chair, what the speaker over there is saying is extremely important. It's related to what Vinod is saying about human resources. One of the issues why we have a problem with our costs in the poultry area as well as fishing area is because the inputs are too expensive. Poultry feed is something else in Kenya compared to what it is in Uganda. If you take even veterinary services, what it costs to get a veterinary service in a farm in this part of the world for animals, dairy and poultry is very high compared to Uganda. When you come to fish, if you have a fish cage within the Ugandan boundary of the lake, you'll get fish feeds as perhaps 50% what the Kenyan side pays. So you can't compete. That's one of the reasons why you found at one time that we had Chinese fish being sold here when Lake Victoria is next door. Of course, one reason was environmental degradation, which didn't make it possible for some fish species to grow in big numbers. But the most important thing is that production of fish in China cost is much lower than ours. These are things that can be sorted out. I don't think they are rocket science. The other issue that actually my friend Mukisha Kitui was raising here, and I see somebody has also brought it to me, is the issue of cold storage for both lake produce and farm produce. If you're going to bulk them and export them and so on. I know on the lake I've been touring the ports or the landing bays, the fishing bays on our side of the lake, and inspecting the presence of storage plants. they are significant by their absence, okay? And partly it's a private sector initiative which can be aided by us, but partly it's also a public initiative to make it possible that infrastructure exists and can be rented by private or can be made available for fish storage. But one thing I must accept is this irrationality of taxing trade in between counties as a way of raising domestic revenue in counties. I think it is cutting the nose to spite the feet, as it were. I think it's something that we'll be discussing with the Council of Governors, but I don't think we've come out with a solution. And I think a solution is much more urgent than anything before. But that solution relates to allowing counties to get their revenue in legitimate areas that are suddenly dominated by government, national government entities performing functions that should be performed by counties. It could create space for revenue generation, which at the moment is being denied the counties. Those two are interdependent, and we should look at them very critically and solve them.
Governor Nyong'o, before I let you go, please, there's something you've mentioned which I'd like to pick up from there. The question of on-source revenue. If you look at the public finance management framework, can I be heard here? If you look at the public finance management framework, the sources of revenue allocated to counties are cess, market, entertainment, which many would argue are not very strong as far as mobilizing revenue is concerned. Do you think there is a place for the argument that perhaps the national government should cede some core centers of revenue generation, for example, VAT, to the devolved units?
Okay, this is what I'm saying, that we need to look at this revenue generation very carefully. One, we also must look at how we bake the cake, okay? You know, you can only divide the cake among so many people depending on the size of the cake. And the problem in Kenya today is that the cake is not that big. So by the time the national government takes 3/4 of the cake, the other quarter to be shared over the 47 counties, it's not much. So in terms of creating wealth in this country and taxing it. Now, I worked in Massachusetts for a brief period of time when I was teaching at Harvard. And I realized that when I got my payslip, there was a state tax, you know, like income tax. So there's a federal tax and a state tax. In Kenya, we have devolution, but without devolution tax. Were we to introduce devolution tax, money that is paid and goes straight to the kitty of devolved government, or where it is paid, for example, if you are living in Kisumu, you pay taxes to the state or to the county of Kisumu, another tax of national government. It would be a much more neat way of sharing revenue at the national level than this cumbersome thing of taking what, no division of revenue bill, blah, blah, blah. I mean, to me, I find it kind of not very ingenious, you know. There's a way of getting revenue to counties much faster at the source, rather than taking the national government, then you say, what percentage will we take, and then debates in the National Assembly or the Senate for 3 months after the financial year started. 3 months later, money comes. It's kind of silly, you know what I mean?
Yes.
There must be a neater way of doing it, the way the US did it. It's not rocket science.
Thank you so much, Governor Nyong'o, for those thoughts. Let me cross over to Ethiopia before I come back here, gentlemen. To Tewolde, who is the Group Chief Executive Officer of Ethiopian Airlines. Aviation has had a bit of a turbulent year, or should I say a significantly turbulent year. When you look at 2021 and the Kenyan and East African recovery for that matter, how do you see aviation positioned for takeoff, like literally?
Okay, let me come in here. I'm deputizing the group CEO. My name is Isaias. I'm the deputy CEO and the chief commercial officer. The coming year, when it comes to COVID and aviation, it has a lot of hopes embedded in it. Number one, governments need to balance. Government needs to balance. Each and every government in Africa and in the region needs to balance the COVID-19 measures with economic interest, without watering down our guard on COVID, so that not to compromise the general public's health, but at the same time, economic interests also need to be taken care of. Countries shouldn't be overreacting disproportionately, because in that case, people who die of economic problems and hunger would be more than those who are affected by COVID. So the second is governments also need to prioritize restart of aviation in this way, that aviation means tourism, aviation means import-export, aviation also means a lot of other services for the travel agents, for the tour operator. It's one of the biggest employers. So governments need to pay attention to this, especially in Africa. Even pre-COVID, there has been a lot of problem, like aviation infrastructures are very expensive, and African airlines have not been faring well even pre-COVID. So now that COVID comes and economic impact is also overbearing, African governments need to look into how they can make aviation infrastructures a little bit more affordable to the African aviators. So that also needs to be done. So with these kinds of measures and interventions from the governments, 2021 could be good for African aviation because, number one, humanity is not designed to be locked down. Humanity is a mobile species, so mobility necessity is always pushing for mobility. So if the right measures from the side of the governments are done, and from the airline side, the next year, I hope, will be very good for African aviation.
All right. Thank you so much for those comments. And I should say that was not Tewolde, as I'd mentioned. My apologies for that. Let me cross over to Dr. Narendra Raval, the CEO of DevKey Group. There's a lot of concern about the cost of industry. You're a key industrialist in this region. What are the challenges you're facing, and how do you see 2021 unfolding as far as this is concerned, Dr. Narendra? Sorry, we can't hear Dr. Narendra. All right, I'm told we have a bit of a sound challenge as far as getting his audio is concerned. But there was a comment from the floor here. If I could get a mic to this gentleman, please, to share his thoughts. Just behind Governor Nyong'o here, please. Please introduce yourself as always and let us know your thoughts. Thank you.
My name is Matthew Ochieng-Owili, the County Deputy Governor. There's this interesting conversation about the fact that we import quite a bit of products, some of them very essential. Dr. Mukisa Kitui yesterday did mention that we're importing more than 90% of our pharmaceutical products into the country at a time when, as a country, we're talking about universal health coverage. We know also that we import, very essential products, as essential as, a toothpick. And I know there's a conversation now of whether we have the right skills in the country to be able to, to produce. I want to believe that we do have the right skills, but as a country, we must, address the issue of the cost of production. You begin to, to appreciate how heavy the cost is. If, for example, you look at the taxes, that are levied when you even buy electricity tokens. So until the government, of the day, deliberately moves to, address that issue of the cost of production, it will be very difficult as a country, okay, for us to move forward from where we are. But I also believe also that as a country, we need to invest in research and development. That's another area where we are doing very poorly as a country. And without research, without research and development, it's very difficult for us, to move to the next level of, production locally and as a country. So those are my thoughts, and it will be interesting to hear the views of Dr. Mukisa Kitui in regard to the issue of reducing the cost of production. so that we can start to produce, simple products. Like you can't imagine that a product like Panadol, produced in this country is much more expensive than the ones that we import, okay, from India and other destinations. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much, Deputy Governor, for that thought. And I really have to sympathize because come January, we have minimum tax kicking in. We have digital services tax kicking in. We'll be having a conversation on that. I'll be coming back to Dr. Mukisa here. Let me just...